Our next speaker is Dr. Gene Smith. He is a returning speaker for us from about 5 years ago. 6. Thank you, sir. Dr. Smith is a professor of history at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. He is an author or editor of 10 books, as well as numerous articles and reviews on the War of 1812, naval and maritime history, and territorial expansion along the Gulf of Mexico. His most recent book is In Harm's Way, The American Military Experience, Oxford, 2019. He is also a prize-winning teacher, pugilism? No. Having received awards at TCU on Montana State University Billings, as well as having served as the 2013-2014 academic year as a class of 1957 Distinguished Chair in Naval Heritage at the United States Naval Academy. Since 2002, he has also served as the director of the Center for Texas Studies at TCU, and from 2007 to 2014, he was also a curator of history at a major Fort Worth museum. Please welcome, Dr. Smith will be speaking about Americans aspire to supremacy over the future republics of the New World, manifest destiny in the Adams-Onis Treaty. Please welcome Dr. Smith.
You're very kind. Okay, can you guys hear me? I have this problem. I have a teacher/preacher voice, and like Juliana, I have a hard time staying confined here. So if I do wander around, I'll use my teacher-preacher voice, and then that way you'll still be able to hear me without this thing here. Where Professor Barr here spoke this morning about native empires and their control of geographic regions, what I'm going to spend a little time talking about today is a geographic line determined by Americans and Spaniards in Washington, D.C., that ultimately defined to whom the West belonged. And that's the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Negotiated 1819, goes into effect in 1821. And, you know, the funny thing about the Adams-Onis Treaty is that most people know very little about this. And when people do know about it, they say, oh, yeah, that's the Florida Treaty, because it does bring the peninsula of Florida into the United States. Or they call it the Florida Purchase Treaty. Well, the United States didn't purchase Florida. That's a big discretion. But a treaty that settles the Florida question by bringing Florida into the United States. The Spanish cede Florida to the United States, but it also defines the boundary between the United States and España Nueva. And it temporarily settles a border dispute between the United States and Spain, which at the time, most Americans considered this to be a triumph of American diplomacy. More importantly, I say, is that this treaty helped determine the fate of Texas. Yes. The treaty came in the midst of increasing tensions in Spain's territorial boundaries in North America. Florida had become a burden to Spain, and the Spanish government could not afford to send new garrisons. They couldn't afford to send new settlers. So the Spanish government decided, why not give up this territory in order to secure a more rigidly defined boundary, western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, and therefore clearly demarcate what is the boundary between the United States and Spain, a boundary along the Sabine River. Well, as we know, the treaty does give us Florida, and the treaty also establishes a stair-stepped boundary across the Great Plains, through the Rocky Mountains, west of the Pacific. And the interesting thing about this is that the United States doesn't have to buy it. And that's where textbooks and students often say, oh yeah, the United States paid $5 million for Florida. No, they didn't. The United States provided $5 million that was then paid to American residents who had claims against the Spanish government. So, in effect, American citizens became a little enriched, and the United States acquired territory, and the Spanish thought they had won the deal. Now, this treaty is going to remain in effect for only 183 days, from February 22nd to August 24th, 1821. And at that point, the Spanish military officials signed the Treaty of Cordoba, which acknowledged the independence of Mexico. Now, the Spanish government later repudiated that treaty, but nonetheless, Mexico still took control over Tejas. And then the United States would negotiate a treaty with the Mexicans called the Treaty of Limits, signed in 1828, becomes effective in 1832, that recognizes the border of the Adams-Onis Treaty, the border that defined the boundary between the United States and Mexico, or Texas, I should say. Now, part of the reason that Spain is willing to negotiate this treaty is that Spain is experiencing problems in its New World Empire. The Latin American wars for independence were beginning to rack the Spanish New World Empire, and this chaos provided Americans an opportunity to expand Thomas Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. And this Empire of Liberty, what Jefferson envisioned, was a nation that spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and at any point in time, he talked about controlling all of North America as well as Central South America as well, expanding the boundaries. And for most Americans, it was simply following the setting sun, looking to the west. As far as the sun sets on Western territory, that should be in American hands. Now, Jefferson truly believed that Tejas had been a part of the Louisiana Purchase. And he believed that it was a part of America's God-given lands. He had set a very important tone in this idea. In 1786, Jefferson had written to a friend that our continent must be viewed as the nest from which all America, north and south, is to be peopled. Now, one of the interesting things is that in 1791, the Spanish governor of East Florida, Governor Quesada, he had invited 100,000 Americans to settle in Florida. Now, what Quesada believed is that if these Americans arrived and they were given land and they swore to take an allegiance to the Spanish government and they professed to be Spanish Catholics, then that would prevent America from taking control, the United States from taking control over Florida. And Jefferson thought this was a wonderful idea. He said he wished 100,000 Americans would go there. And he said it would give us peaceably what might otherwise cost us a war. Now, this really embodies how Jefferson envisioned Americans were going to take control over North America. Americans would just filtrate into a territory, and they would, acquire land. They would become happy until this foreign power tried to control or rule them. And then at that point, they would start grumbling, start protesting, and then they would want to throw off the yoke of that foreign oppressor, and they'd want to create their own republic. And not surprisingly, they will almost always create a flag that has one central feature: a star. The star can always join the constellation of stars and stripes. So for Jefferson, for his first inaugural address, 1801, he said the United States was a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the 100th and 1000th generation. Well, now, Jefferson is pretty precise about his calculations. He considers a generation to be 30 years. So 100 generations is 3,000 years. 1,000 generations is 30,000 years. So he's saying there's enough land in North America for 3,000 to 30,000 years. He missed the boat on that one. Yeah. In fact, Secretary of War James Barber in 1827, he even mentioned that there was enough land for 500 years. He missed the boat on that one too. But in any case, when Jefferson makes his statement that there's enough land for 100th and 1,000th generations, that it was a chosen country, his country was already confined. It was confined by the British in the north. It's confined by the Spanish in the south and in the west. It's confined by Dr. Barr's Native American nations. And shortly after the War of 1812, when Jefferson is no longer president, he writes to a dear friend, John Jacob Astor. And he said he looked forward with gratification to a time when the entirety of the Pacific coast would be populated with free and independent Americans. And even during his presidency, he had talked about it was not impossible to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent. So Jefferson has these grandiose dreams of Americans being everywhere. Expansion throughout the continent, expansion throughout the hemisphere. It preserves cherished American principles, American beliefs from European destruction. Absolutely. Now, if you know a little bit about Jefferson's presidency, when he's serving as president, it's a period of great territorial growth and expansion. In fact, in 1803, Ohio becomes a state, Indiana becomes a territory. By the end of 1803, the United States had acquired Louisiana, and James Wilkinson's accepting of Louisiana from French control in December of 1803. Captain Amos Stoddard would travel up to St. Louis in March of 1804 and take possession of the Louisiana territory. Everybody thinks, well, wait a minute, wasn't it the Wilkinson's raising the flag in New Orleans? Didn't that take control of the Louisiana territory? No, that took control of the Orleans territory. And Amos Stoddard went up to St. Louis and took control of the Louisiana territory. The Louisiana Purchase is one of the great mysteries of America, because the United States bought land west of the Mississippi. Now, if you've ever traveled to New Orleans, it's actually on the east side of Mississippi. So how do we get New Orleans? Well, the treaty called for the Isle of Orleans and land west of the Mississippi River. Well, the Isle of Orleans is a piece of land that is bounded by the Mississippi River, by Lake Pontchartrain in the north, by Lake Bourne in the east, and by the Gulf of Mexico in the south. That's the Isle of Orleans. So we got New Orleans and all that land to the west. And for Jefferson, that convinced him there was enough land for his 100th and 1,000th generation. The problems were that the French left that treaty very vague in regards to the western boundary. The eastern boundary is pretty easy to define, Mississippi River and that Isle of Orleans. That western boundary, I mean, there's a lot of land out here. There's a number of those Indian nations out there who are going to contest that claim as well. Well, although the western boundaries remained unclear, the Louisiana Purchase is absolutely Jefferson's crowning achievement. And it helped him realize what he called this empire of liberty. Enough land that every American could have their own little homestead, their own little farm. And as I tell my students all the time, what that means is that every person can have their little white picket fenced house, their two-car garage, their Land Rover, and their Beamer. That's what the acquisition of territory that brought security. And what I can say is that appearances are deceiving because there's not enough land. But the acquisition of Louisiana does momentarily satisfy Americans. But soon thereafter, American eyes will start focusing toward the setting sun, looking to the west, looking to what can be seized next. Almost a spirited rambunctiousness that we will later label kind of profoundly as manifest destiny. To me, Manifest Destiny is one of the greatest expressions in American history. You know, it's the idea that there's a God-given right for Americans to have all the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And why did God choose us? Well, it's a providential mission. Even since the time of John Winthrop and the landing at the Puritans in Boston, they believed that they were a city upon a hill. They were God's chosen people, and this idea of Manifest Destiny was just a continuation of that providential mission. Well, that sounds very distinguished and very proper. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty of how Manifest Destiny really works. And I want to tell you a story about something that happens in September 1810, and of all places, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Baton Rouge is the capital of Spanish West Florida. There's a Spanish fort there. It's dilapidated. The Spanish hadn't spent money on it in decades. There's about 30 some odd soldiers there and an officer. And Americans had been moving into that district since as early as 1802, 1803. And the Spanish had given them land. But finally, by 1810, the rules were beginning to change. And Americans were frustrated with Spanish control. So in September 1810, a handful of Americans led a revolt against the Spanish fort at Baton Rouge. They stormed through the gaps in the stockade. They quickly overran the fort. One Spanish soldier is killed. And then all of a sudden, West Florida had become the Republic of West Florida. They called a constitutional meeting. They drafted a document that's eerily similar to the American Constitution. And, as I mentioned earlier, they also created a flag. A single white star on an azure blue field. And I know, please don't hiss me at this point. The Louisianans claim that they were the original Lone Star Republic. I know that last weekend there was a football game down here between that state and this state. Yeah, absolutely. That's the way I feel. Enough said. But nonetheless, what this little episode showed us is the way that Manifest Destiny works. People move into a territory, they settle, they acquire land, they have lives, and then at some point they become frustrated and they want to throw off the yoke of Spanish control. They rise up, they seize control, they draft a formal document, and they claim that they're a free and independent republic. Now, the Republic of West Florida sent a note to Secretary of State James Monroe and to President James Madison asking to be annexed into the Union. And Madison drags his feet on this. He waits a full 2 months later and then finally makes an announcement that, oh, well, this part of Louisiana was a part of the Louisiana Purchase anyways. So we're just going to take control of it as a part of Louisiana. What he's trying to do is not create difficulties with Spain. It's the basic conception of to conquer without war. To conquer land without having to fight to gain control of it. Well, remember this, because the annexation of this Baton Rouge district, in the years before Manifest Destiny, it proves that Manifest Destiny is bubbling as early as 1810. Now, one of the interesting things about this revolt in Baton Rouge, it happens at the same time as a revolt starting in Mexico under Father Miguel Hidalgo. Hidalgo's revolution of 1810. In fact, there's some circumstantial evidence to say that these were timed to coincide. Well, if you know what happens in Hidalgo's revolution, he initiates a nationalist independence movement. It spreads throughout northern Mexico, and ultimately, at its peak, Hidalgo's followers gained control over Guanajuato, over Guadalajara, New Santander, Coahuila, and even gained control over San Antonio. In fact, when Spanish troops finally traveled to San Antonio in 1813, there's a young lieutenant who's a part of that expedition by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. That was his first time to San Antonio. Well, one of Hidalgo's followers is Jose Bernardo Maximiliano Gutierrez de Lara. And when Hidalgo's revolt fails, he travels to Washington and meets with Secretary of State James Monroe, meets with President Madison, and ultimately James Monroe introduces him to a Cuban revolutionary by the name of Don Jose Alvarez de Toledo y Dubois. That's a mouthful. A Cuban revolutionary with a French name. And Monroe also introduces him to an army officer who had served under James Wilkinson by the name of Augustus William McGee. And the plan was for Gutierrez, Toledo, and McGee to lead an expedition into Texas. And in the chaos of Spain's crumbling New World Empire, Americans could just kind of slice a piece off. Well, that's what they thought. So they will cross from Natchitoches in Louisiana through the neutral ground. If you were here yesterday, one of my doctoral students talked about the neutral ground. He said he forgot to offer his joke about the highwaymen that were raiding that, and he's not talking about, Johnny Cash or Chris Christopherson or Willie or Waylon. But nonetheless, they cross through the neutral ground to Nacogdoches. The Spanish garrison there surrenders without a fight. Then they march south to La Bahia. And there they take control over La Bahia before Spanish troops try to besiege the fort for about 4 weeks. Finally, they break the siege there. I said 4 weeks, 4 months. They break the siege there and march on to San Antonio, gain control over San Antonio. And once this rebellion, once this insurrection gains control over San Antonio, there's a desire to get revenge for Spanish control. So Governor Manuel Salcedo and many of the high-ranking Spanish officers are executed. And that tended to alienate many of the Americans who had been a part of this expedition. And they chose to return home. And as they return home, there's a power coup between the remaining Americans, the Tejanos, and ultimately Gutierrez de Lara dies. And finally, by August of 1813, the Spanish force arrives and defeat the insurrectionists at the Battle of the Medina River, quelling once and for all this Gutierrez, Toledo, McGee revolt. But it wasn't just this revolt. Almost at the same time, there are other attempts to acquire this land. And the quote for the title of my presentation is actually from a Frenchman by the name of Arsène Leclerc-Latour. You may not have ever heard of him. He was Andrew Jackson's principal engineer at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, he had arrived in New Orleans in 1804. He had been a French military engineer on Haiti, and as Donatin Rochambeau is evacuating Haiti, he flees to New Orleans, reportedly on a boat that's owned by the Lafitte brothers. He arrives in New Orleans, and having no real marketable skill other than being an engineer, he began to market himself as an architect and engineer. And one of the more important buildings he designed while he was in New Orleans is the Napoleon House, which is still there in the French Quarter today. A few years later, he was hired by the Spanish government to do the plan laying out the old town of Baton Rouge. So he's a bit of a Renaissance man. And he runs an architecture school in New Orleans, and he has a number of clients. I mean, there's still buildings you can travel around and see in the French Quarter where the ironwork still denotes that it was Latour's architectural project. But nonetheless, Latour was trying to make a life for himself. And in 1812, he did agree to become a citizen of the United States. So by the time the War of 1812 begins, Arsène Licari Latour was an American citizen of French derivation living in New Orleans, not unusual. Well, by the fall of 1814, the War of 1812 comes to the Gulf Coast. And Andrew Jackson arrives in town and realizes there's no defenses. He has no soldiers to speak of. So Andrew Jackson has to cobble together a multinational heterogeneous army to defend against the British invasion. And he will rely on Latour to be his engineer. It's Latour who decides to build the defenses at Chalmette. It's Latour who talks about using cotton bales. Not cotton bales as the defense, but cotton bales sunk into the mud to provide platforms for the cannons. And it's Latour who designs the defenses on the West Bank. Well, of course, Jackson wins a resounding victory at New Orleans. And by March of 1815, the army is dismissed. And Latour is out of work. His architectural business had fallen in arrears, so he doesn't quite know what to do. So he decides, in the aftermath of the war, he is going to write a book. So he writes the first book on the Battle of New Orleans, published in 1816. It is called The Historical Memoir of the War in West Florida and Louisiana. And what is so cool about this book, that's a 1999 edition that I had the good fortune of being able to edit and bring out. And the reason I did that is just because I wanted a copy of the damn book. I tried to buy it, and it was like $4,500. And I said, geez, I'm an academic. I can't afford that. But what's so good about this book is that the first half of it is a narrative of the campaign. The second half of it is documents. Documents that he collected, and as he said, he put in the book to provide the evidence of his story. And so I'd been trying to get this book. And in 1997, I sent a note to a friend at the Historic New Orleans Collection saying, you know, it'd really be a good idea if we did a reprint of this book. And I didn't tell him because I want a copy of it. And my friend, who was the director of the collection at the time, he would normally email me, but it'd be 3 or 4 days later. And like 10 minutes later, I got a note from him saying, you'll never guess, we just bought the Latour family collection. And I was like, wow. So he said, let's do the book, and you can do a revised and updated appendix, adding new documents that Latour had collected to make a second edition. So among those documents were some very important War Department documents from time when James Monroe was Secretary of War that you will not find in the War Department files anymore because Monroe gave them to Latour. Well, in any case, he writes the book for a reason. He's got a nice picture of Andrew Jackson in the front of it. And he was trying to make money on it. The book never sells what he thinks it will. You know, he's a historian. It doesn't sell a lot. And then after that, he's like, well, crap, what am I going to do for money now? So he travels to Washington and to Philadelphia. And while he's there, he meets with Secretary of State James Monroe. He meets with Don Diego Luis de Onís, the Spanish minister of the United States. He meets with Peter Stephen Duponceau and John Jacob Astor. he's meeting with all the movers and shakers. And when he meets, in fact, he meets with Monroe on 2 occasions. And the frustrating thing about this as a historian, you have evidence that they met, but there's no notes about the meeting. Because if they keep notes about the meeting, it'll say, well, I'm encouraging you to do something illegal. So you just have to extrapolate from what they say after and before what they talk about. And what we know is that Monroe was talking to Latour about Gutierrez de Lara's expedition, the Gutierrez-Toledo-McGee expedition. He's talking to him about American eyes being focused on Texas as a part of the Louisiana Purchase. So Latour, with his friend Jean Lafitte, make a contract with the Spanish to go on an expedition for the Spanish. They would leave from New Orleans and they would travel up into the Arkansas Territory to explore the gold lands of Arkansas. And yes, believe it or not, you can discover gold in Arkansas. But in reality, Latour, traveling as an alias by the name of John Williams, they really traveled to the headwaters of the Sabine, the Red, the Trinidad, the Arkansas, the Colorado rivers. And Latour, being a military man, he wrote a detailed reconnaissance of what he had encountered there. And it's kind of interesting because when he returned, a copy of this would be given to Luis de Onís, be given to the Viceroy of Mexico, the Governor General of Cuba, the Spanish minister to the U.S., as well as to all the governors of the Northern Territories. A copy would be given to Secretary of State James Monroe, well, by this time President James Monroe, and it would pass on to Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. But in that, he warned that Americans were already starting to flood into Texas. He said the Americans aspire to the supremacy over the future republics of the New World, and this desire is founded on national interest rather than the liberality of ideas and the happiness of mankind. He said the government works for this purpose, and the first author of this plan is Mr. Jefferson. Well, Latour was convinced that should Spain not do something, the time will come, and unfortunately is not far off, when Americans will pour in myriads into Mexico. These Americans, he contended, have strength of character, courage, skill in the use of their guns, and their eyes fixed on Mexico like the Jews on the promised land. And he insisted that these Americans, they would join any movement. They would join any expedition, even if it had little prospect of success, because they have everything to gain and nothing to lose. Well, Latour is giving a playbook to the Spanish. And yes, this report does reach the Spanish governors in the Northern Territories, in Coahuila, in Tejas. And they say, tell us something new. We know Americans are flooding in. We've even considered putting up a wall to keep the Americans out. Isn't it funny how times change? Well, in the immediate aftermath of Latour's expedition, you would have new expeditions trying to establish a foothold in Texas, including Louis Michel Ari, who had joined, a French privateer who had joined with the Lafitte brothers to establish a privateering bases out of Galveston. And there they were plundering Spanish ships. Unfortunately, they started plundering American ships as well, up until January of 1819, when Master Commandant Daniel Todd Patterson, the commander of the New Orleans Naval Station, sent a fleet of 4 ships over to talk to Latour and his fellow privateers. And ultimately what they did is they hung 9 pirates right off the shore so that Lafitte and his fellow privateers could see that pirates are not going to be held in high esteem. Well, after that, Ari and Lafitte both left Galveston. Now, if you know anything about the Lafitte myth, you know, there's one line of that myth that says he ends up going to Central America where he dies in Belize. And there's a second part of that myth that said, oh no, he survived at least into the 1850s, because there's a diary that appeared in the 1950s that was reportedly Lafitte's diary. And the conditions of the diary could only be published 100 years after his death. And of course, you read this diary and you think, oh my God, this is great stuff. How could it really be true? Well, it wasn't. It was a fake. But after the Lafitte brothers, you will have a French settlement established at Champs-de-Gilles. French Napoleonic general Charles Lalemande, he establishes a settlement there for Napoleonic officers. This is a sister settlement to one that will be established in Alabama called Vineland. It's really today what we call Demopolis. And they were to be agricultural settlements. Former soldiers, they were to create a settlement there. But what they were planning for was the eventual return of Napoleon. And that Napoleon could have this empire along the Gulf of the United States, white sand beaches, and ultimately condos as well. Well, this expedition does not last very long, because guess what happens to Napoleon? He's going to be poisoned on St. Helena in the South Atlantic, and once news of his death had made the rounds, these Napoleonic officers decided, I'm not staying here in Texas or anymore. And the colony in Alabama does actually survive, because they bought into slavery and cotton production and got pretty wealthy. But here in Texas, it was still pretty much the frontier. And then you had those Native Americans to worry about as well. So it wasn't an ideal place to be. But all of this is happening. All this chaos is happening when James Monroe, Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, offers a deal to Don Luis Onís, the Spanish minister of the United States, to settle the Florida question. Because Florida was so very important. I mean, where were you going to put Disneyland if you didn't have Florida? Well, actually, look at it. What's so interesting about Florida is that it looks like a pistol. There's the stock of the pistol. There's the barrel of the pistol. And what is it pointing to? The Mississippi River. So if you control Florida, you have some control over that river. So Florida had to be brought into the Union. So ultimately, what Adams is going to propose is that they make a deal for the peninsula of Florida. And in return, the United States will agree to a boundary along this kind of stair-step boundary onto the Pacific that would provide a clearly delineated western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Well, ultimately what happens here is that the treaty will be signed in February of 1819, yet Spain will delay the ratification for 2 years. The United States does acquire the peninsula of Florida, but because of that two-year delay, what happens is that American politicians decide, well, if Spain is going to drag their feet on this, we need to get Texas as well. And Adams is not willing to break the deal to secure Florida to get Texas. Instead, he understood that by creating this boundary there, what it gave the United States was a Continental Empire, an unquestioned Continental Empire, an empire that stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. And knowing what Latour had said in that report, it was only a matter of time before Americans start flooding in to Texas. Well, even though Adams gave up Texas, as president he tried to buy Texas, and Andrew Jackson tried to buy Texas. Well, we know that that didn't quite work. What I can tell you is that all the flooding in of these white settlers from the United States, well, guess what's going to happen from that? Well, very simply, I got about a minute here, about a half minute. You know, one of those white settlers, Stephen F. Austin, he brings people to settle on the lower reaches of the Trinity. By 1825, you have 2,000 white settlers there. By 1830, you have 10,000. By 1835, you have 20,000 with 2,000 slaves. And, well, yep, they decide that they're willing to live there as long as they're given land and they profess to be Catholic. You know, I'm Catholic. But by 1836, I'm sure somebody else is going to talk about this in a minute. So nonetheless, all I can say is that March 6, 1836, John Wayne, Lawrence Harvey, Richard Widmark, you know, they die there at the Alamo, along with 180 some odd other men. But the point I'm making here is that this revolution, what it does, and with the acquisition, with the defeat of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at San Jacinto, well, this is going to create the Republic of Texas. You noticed, one too far. You notice there that there's a star in the Lone Star Republic. Well, Texas wanted to be a part of the United States, and for 8 years, not until President John Tyler is able to negotiate it through a joint resolution of Congress, which is a simple majority in both houses. He's able to bring Texas into the Union in the face of James K. Polk's election mandate. Well, it added that 28th star to the flag. And the last thing I will say here, 2 days before Texas officially became a state, in December of 1846, a New York newspaper editor named John Lewis O'Sullivan, he published an editorial in which he said, "The right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federative development of self-government entrusted to us. It is right such as that of the tree to the space of air, and the earth suitable for the full expansion of its principle and destiny of growth." That's manifest destiny. And in the years that followed, those American eyes kept following the setting sun on to the Pacific. So, thank you very much, guys. I'm sorry I ran over. You ask questions, make up questions, I'll make up answers.
Please wait for a microphone.
Right here behind you.
At the beginning, you were talking about the days that the treaty stayed in effect.
Yes.
Can you, do a real quick recap of that? You said 183 days, but then what?
183 days.
And that was, then what happened? Just a quick little.
The Spanish military lost to the Mexicans, and the Spanish military signed the Treaty of Cordoba, which gave Mexico its independence. As Mexico gains its independence, the Spanish government repudiated that treaty. And like I said, 183 days. It was from February to August of 18, I forgot right now. What's that?
February 27th to August 1821.
Okay, there we go. All the details I tend to forget.
Thank you.
Yep.
Whatever, whatever possessed the Spanish and later the Mexicans to believe they could hang on to territory they wouldn't garrison and defend?
Why did the Spanish, well, by the 19th century, the Spanish Empire is crumbling. You know, at one time they controlled an empire that stretched throughout the Atlantic, throughout the Western Hemisphere. And over time, it has just slowly been chipped away. And by the beginning of the 19th century, they are just hanging on for what they can control. And of course, there's all these revolutions starting in Central and South America. I mean, if you keep in mind that by the end of the 19th century, they still have Cuba and Puerto Rico. So they're hanging on to what they can. The empire, the whole idea, you know, it's kind of ironic. When the Spanish raided the Aztec Empire and they accumulated all this gold and silver from the Aztecs and from the Incas, everyone thought the Spanish Empire would never decline. Well, the problem was the trade goods that were needed for the empire were not being produced in Spain. So all that money was being spent for trade goods that then had to be shipped to the New World. So all the money that was coming in was just kind of going out to all these various subcontractors. And Spain wasn't able to develop an empire or develop the foundation of an empire that they could hold on to.
I read a book by the Kirkendalls on how when Austin was getting his 300 families together, the United States government took the land away from the American citizens in Arkansas and gave it to the Indians, and they were without homes, and how the Arkansas people signed up with Austin and came down into Texas because their homes had been taken away from them, and free land was a big thing.
Well, absolutely. The American government on the frontier is trying to maintain peace, not trying to provoke a war with the Spanish and then with the Mexicans. But just as Latour said, you know, that's part of the reason that these Americans are flooding in from Arkansas. And one of the ironies is, you know, certainly by the time of Andrew Jackson, it's, you know, Jackson wants to remove the Indians from the east to the west and put them on, you know, on reservations where they can be protected and their culture can survive. And what he didn't realize is that by doing so, you know, it came from a report written by Zebulon Pike where he called it the Great American Desert. So you put them out on the Great American Deserts, and of course in the early 20th century they found oil, and then the beginning of the 21st century they found gambling. And you know, they've kind of gotten their revenge on America.
Last question, I think, sir. Please use the microphone.
I don't remember in my Texas history about the United States having the coastline of Texas. How did that come about in the early 1800s?
Well,
Showed that
there was
spread.
Thomas Jefferson claimed with the Louisiana Purchase that the Louisiana Purchase stretched all the way to the Rio Grande. And then when the Spanish pushed back on that, he said, well, it certainly extends to the Trinity. And of course, by 1806, there's this neutral ground there between Louisiana and Texas, where it's both nations claim, but neither nation is able to exercise any control in. And that's why it becomes such a haven for those highwaymen who like to sing as well. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys.